the part that Pastor Karen will lead, because that will be more of a discussion. So it's Reformation Sunday. This is something you have to learn when you're in confirmation at St. Matthew's. So it's time for a pop quiz. Okay.
Oh boy.
Name, this is Reformation Sunday, so you should get this. Name the reformer who was an exceptional student, who was ordained a priest, who preached in his native language as opposed to Latin, who was a theologian at the local university, whose teachings on the selling of indulgences got him excommunicated, who then lived for a time in exile, and who, when brought before a papal council and put on trial, refused to recant his beliefs.
Martin Luther King.
Well, those of you who said Martin Luther, that is right, but the person I was thinking of is a man named Jan Hus. He was all of those things too.
Right.
Sounds so similar to Martin Luther, right? So why Jan Hus came 100 years before Martin Luther? Why aren't we called the Evangelical Hussite Church of America? Why didn't Jan Hus become the famous reformer that Martin Luther became? There are several very good reasons for that. So I want to go through the cultural factors that led to the time being right for the Reformation. The Reformation happened when it happened because all of these things came together and created the perfect platform for Martin Luther to begin the Reformation. So it wasn't Martin Luther, it was this guy. Oh no. Here we go. Jan Hus. What happened to Jan Hus?
He was killed.
He was burned at the stake, right? So the same exact message that Martin Luther had, and he was burned at the stake. Before he was executed, he said, Hus means goose. And he lived in Bohemia, so it means goose. And he said before he was executed, today you will roast a goose, but in 100 years a swan will arise. And the swan is Martin Luther. That's who we say the swan is. And his followers are still out there today. They're called Moravians. Do you know about the Moravian Church? They're the direct descendants of Jan Hus. So there were cultural factors that contributed to the Reformation. The first is the Renaissance. I'm sure this is something you've all studied, you all know about or read books about. And the Renaissance can be characterized by a huge openness to new ideas, to the scientific method. There were huge advances in the arts and sciences. So not only were people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo doing their thing, they were advancing the techniques that artists used to do art. It was just a huge time of change and advancement, and including this man. This is Copernicus and his heliocentric universe, where he said the sun is at the center of everything, not the earth. And he got into big trouble for that too. So people were shifting even their ideas of what they thought the universe looked like and what they thought was real. And being able to stand on the earth and not move and watch the planets move, but understand that you're not at the center of the universe. This is the kind of thing that was happening at this time. Including the discovery of the New World, right? So everything was going through a change, including trade to a whole new continent that Europe and the East had never traded with before. So this is part of what led to the time being right for the Reformation. Perhaps the biggest contributor to that, why do I have to go back out every time? is this.
The printing press.
The printing press. This is a model of Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. Martin Luther, you all know this story, posted his 95 Theses on October 31st, 1517 on the door of the University Church in Wittenberg in order to start a conversation. Why Halloween? Does anybody know why Martin Luther posted the Theses on Halloween? Leah.
I know it's from confirmation last year. That he wanted the living and the dead or the saints to be able to read them too.
Yes, he, All Hallows Eve, right, the night before All Saints Day, All Hallows Eve, the fabric, the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead grows so thin that the dead can walk the earth. And that's part of the reason we have like dressing up and trick-or-treating and spooky things today. So he wanted the living and the dead. He wanted the saints to be able to see the sins of the Catholic Church too. He wanted everybody to know. So he put it on the door of the Castle Church, and he would have ended up at the stake just like Jan Hus, except for the printing press. So at his most prolific, Luther could write something in Germany, and 17 days later it would be mass printed in London. Which is like amazing considering the time. So we could call Martin Luther the world's first best-selling author and the world's first mass media celebrity, right? Because people knew who he was, they read what he wrote, they devoured it. Everything that he wrote, even the bad stuff, they wanted to read. Someday I'm going to understand this quicker. Okay. Also, there was a rising sense of nationalism. Before this, people considered themselves kind of citizens of the Holy Roman Empire, or perhaps, this is my village, right? This is who I am, this is where I'm from, and outside of that, maybe the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. But during this time, people started to recognize, well, those people over there, they have different customs and a different language, and they do things differently, and they're part of the Holy Roman Empire, but they're not like us, right? And so, who knows what this is?
Vatican.
Connor.
St. Peter's Basilica in Rome.
St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City in Rome. This was being built when Martin Luther was preaching about the sins of indulgences. What paid for St. Peter's to be built? Indulgences, right? So all of a sudden people started saying, why should I send my money as a German to build a church in Italy? Why we should build a church here? Why should we pay to have a church built in Rome? So they're understanding themselves as Germans, really for the first time. And so that contributed to all of this too, because Luther was German. And so the German people kind of rallied behind him. Okay, and then next, again, what paid for St. Peter's Basilica? This is an actual indulgence.
Well, I have one in my office. I'll
Go get it. This is, this is what they look like. You could pay to have a loved one who had died spend less time in purgatory. If you paid more, you could get them out of hell. There were kind of levels of this, and it really preyed on people's love for their family and their fear of eternal damnation. And Martin Luther famously said something like, why would you pay for an indulgence when you can't pay for bread? Right? These people are poor. They should not be giving their money to indulgences. They should be feeding their children. So that corruption was rampant, and it was time for a reformation of the Catholic Church because it was so corrupt. And in fact, the Roman Catholic Church had their own reformation. It's called the Council of Trent, and it happened in 1545. So right before Luther's death, the Catholic Church kind of said, maybe we should back off on this whole indulgence thing, and maybe we should clean up some of these archbishops who are living in luxury with their wives. Right? So the Catholic Church did do their own reformation because the corruption was so bad. And then I would say that the other reason the time was right for the Reformation is because of Martin Luther's own life, his own story, and his own understanding of sin, and his own experience of never feeling like he could ever be worthy of God. He would beat himself, which I can't think of the word for right now. Flagellation. He would do that. He would go to his confessor and confess, and then take like 5 steps away and forget about something that he forgot to say, and he'd go back and want to do another confession. And finally his confessor was like, for real, Martin, like, it's enough, it's enough. But he took all of that so seriously that's what prompted him to write these theses to start the movement. So if we take together the Renaissance, the printing press, a rising sense of nationalism, the corruption of the Catholic Church, and Martin Luther's own life and own beliefs, we are at the perfect moment for the Reformation. And this is why we're Lutherans as opposed to Hussites. Okay, and I think that is my part. So you're up, Pastor Sheila.
I forgot until now. So my dad was raised Roman Catholic. He's 100% Irish. And when his older brother was killed in a car accident, his parents' wealthy friends apparently went in together and got the family a papal indulgence, which was in my parents' basement for like my whole life until about 3 years ago when they found it. And my dad was like, well, this needs to be in my Lutheran daughter's. He feels like in Irish Catholic families, you always want to have a son who grows up to be a priest. And so he feels like he scammed the system by having a daughter who is a pastor and he got grandkids from. So anyway, this is a real indulgence. And so you don't see one of them every day. It's not nearly the way that it was during Martin Luther's time, and this is a pre-Vatican II indulgence. But what I wanted to talk about in my little allotted time is the fact that we are living through what would probably be the next greatest upheaval in terms of technology. You know, that we have the internet and the ability to connect and do things and for information to just instantly spread in a way that is unprecedented in human history. Just as impressive as it was that Martin Luther's pen to mass produced in London was 17 days, it's like 17 seconds and something can go viral, right? And we are not the first generation of folks to endure a pandemic or a plague. In fact, there were many people during this Reformation period who had died from the bubonic plague, which would come in waves. And in fact, that's part of the reason that indulgences were such a thing, because so many people had lost so many loved ones. either from the early childhood mortality or from the bubonic plague, or just it was a hard life before we had any idea of how germ theory worked. But what I wanted to talk about was how our pandemic experience was made different by the technology that we have. And one of the really big debates during the Reformation and the time afterwards was about communion. It's sort of sad that you can tell that it is a super important thing to Christians because we have spent so much time arguing about it. Wanting to get it right, to do it right, to understand it right. And for the most part, those conversations had kind of settled down in most quarters up until March of 2020. When all of a sudden there became debates about communion in a way that there hadn't been for a while. Thankfully, no one was trying to burn anyone else at the stake, although there were some less than kind things said about people on Facebook, but that's entirely different. But there was a big question about how do we and can we and should we do communion in this virtual worship. And different denominations and different bishops and different congregations came down differently. There were those who argued that you have to be physically together to have communion. That you can't do this over the internet. You need to be physically present because it's about communion, being in community and being together. And there were those who said, we have no idea how long this is going to last. It is not good to, especially in this time of isolation and crisis, to deny the people of God the gift of communion. Let's rethink this. And so there were some people who said, you know, once upon a time, technology was this like cold, distant thing, but the way people are using it now, it is very much a way that you're with people, whether it's over Zoom. How many people in this room had heard of Zoom in February of 2020? You guys win. How many of you have been on at least one Zoom meeting? How many of you have attended worship virtually? Mm-hmm. How many of you attended worship virtually in 2019? Yeah, that's what I thought. So it was this big expansion. And so there became these conversations about, can we do communion where we are over Zoom, we're all live together apart? Can the pastor preside at communion behind the screen, and then on the computers, wherever you are, simultaneously have people take the elements and receive communion because we are together apart? There were some that said yes, there were some that said no. One article that I read talked about how it was the way that we were, it wasn't any less real when you were connecting with your grandchildren and telling them you loved them over Zoom, that you had recently learned in order to tell your grandchildren you love them and to see them. And so it wouldn't be any less real to be able to hear the words and to receive God's grace. That we have a God who is the creator of heaven and earth, who raised Jesus Christ from the dead, who promises to be with us in the bread and the wine. Why is it that much more of a step to say that God can use the technology of today to make those connections? So like I said, this was very much an open question, and different congregations came down in different places. And I am not really sure that there was ever a right answer. I know of congregations who did drive-through communion. I don't know what you guys all did, but there were congregations where you could like drive up or walk up and the pastor would do communion that way. I knew congregations that put together like communion kits that they like dropped off at people's homes. And I have one friend who she and her congregation, she felt that no matter what they could do, it wouldn't be the same. And so they decided together that they would intentionally fast from communion until they could be together again. And that, the pandemic came in Lent, and Lent is a time of fasting, and so it fit to them to sort of extend that Lenten period of fasting until they were able to be together. And then there was so much like, will we, won't we, do we need to wear masks? Like there was, well, you lived through it. And so at a certain point, they decided that they were going to just have it be a settled question, that they weren't going to commune until Maundy, Thursday, assuming that it was safe. And so they didn't do communion for over a year in their congregation. But it was sort of this digital Reformation, and I think we're in sort of just the beginning stages of it, and the pandemic pushed us. Like, I think before the pandemic, there were churches that had online options. I think you guys were recording. But you were in the, tiny percentage of churches. And then the pandemic hit, and every pastor had to try to figure out how to be a YouTube star. And it was not fun, but it was necessary. And I give thanks for the fact that there was technology to keep us together, apart, in ways that no generation that had faced a pandemic had ever been able to experience. Is that about my time? All right. I'll just start writing.
Yeah, I think this shift then begins to say what happens, and the conversation isn't over. So you raise the issue of our theology around sacraments and what is community, what is participating in worship, and these are questions, at least for me, that continue to linger out there, and why I'm going to go back to retirement and let somebody else figure that out. It's pretty exciting. I had told Sheila, the last interim I did, I had the privilege to give First Communion instruction to a second grader. And we were in person, so his parents met, we learned the stories, he was so excited, he took his first communion. And then fall came and we shut down our in-person worship and went virtual again. And this is the thing, cultural shifts, this next generation, we say they're not going to know anything different. And that's how come the generations become different from one another, because their reality is shaped by something else completely. So this second grader, his mom tells me the story of how Mom and Dad are in the living room on their laptop, and the second grader's in his bedroom on his tablet from school. And Mom and Dad hear him come out of his bedroom, go into the kitchen, grab some juice and a cracker, and head back into his bedroom, where he not only has received his first communion within the community, come to that faith and belief that Christ is real and present to him in the elements. Now he made the leap that Christ is real and present through virtual community in these elements of his own choosing. And I just had to pause, like with Sheila, to say, I don't know the good theology of this. This is what we're wrestling with, and this is what Reform is about, that somehow this practice and this faith have come to this child. And I just, that story sticks with me to honor that. So again, this is when we talk about, I was going to pull up a Bible verse too. And when you're ready, when you're finished. We're going to be talking about reform. What does exactly reform mean to you? Anybody want to take a stab at it? I mean, was the Martin Luther and his supporters wanting to throw out everything? Were they wanting to just fix what was broken? Were they trying to just what as you've learned that word in the church or even in other contexts, what do you think that's about?
Well, wasn't it about, started with the
posting a thesis on all the sins that the church was committing,
Right.
basically.
And what was Luther asking the church to do with that?
Change.
Change. Yeah, he was asking for change, but he was also willing to have conversation. And that famous line, "Here I stand," is also qualified. He finally is being charged and he's making his defense. He goes, "Well, here I stand." It doesn't mean I'm being stubborn and I will never change. He's saying, unless by scripture and reason you can tell me otherwise, here I stand. I think that's important as we enter into facing new ideas, right? So I think that's just going to be a big piece of it. Sheila talked about technology, that's not going away. Our sense of who community is, that isn't going away. For me, too, in that shift is authority, the place of authority. It was the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope, and now we are so proud to say Scripture is available to you to read for yourself and for you to come to faith in your own understanding. And you can do that in a group that you call together on your own. Now the church struggles because you want to learn anything about faith, you go online. And there's some great material and there's some crappy material, right? But people will do that, as we all do, to get educated about some topic, right? And so it becomes a little more difficult for the church to say, well, we are the authority on faith and life. And you come and you do what we tell you to do. Somehow that is not quite have the strength. And so it becomes, what becomes the purpose of the church? Are we the ones with the final word? Or instead, as we're talking with the confirmation students a lot more, let's come together and that our doubts become the beginning of a conversation around what is it we believe. And that community is still a great place for that to happen. For me, so changes. I wanted to just share this Bible verse. This is from Revelation chapter 7. And I heard, if you were at worship, we sang the church is one foundation. And that final verse said, until that day we gather with all the saints around the throne. And that's the vision of where the church is going. That one day we will be gathered with a multitude from every nation, every tribe, every people, every language. We will be diverse, in other words, and we will be standing around the throne before the Lamb. And that is the finish line, if you will. And for me, that world of heaven is right back here on earth, where God finally comes to heal this world one day. And that's our mission, that's our vision. And in the meantime, what's the church, the community of believers going to look like? I think we're going to be open to that kind of levels of change. I'm going to pick that next slide and talk about reform again. So if we say it's being reformed, that we're somehow, I think number 4, trying to restore something to its original format. As Ann said, the Roman Catholic Church even stepped back and said, maybe we need to make some reforms. So if you've been a part of the Lutheran tradition for a long time, what are the things we hold very dear about our belief or our theology or even our practice? That you think are just at the core, we're going back to an original form?
I think the main thing that changed at that time was, instead of doing good works to gain our way to heaven or to forgive our sins, it has to come from within and through grace. And as Joyce talked this morning, there is no greater joy in life than doing something for somebody else.
And where did the reformers go to find that message of grace? Where did they find that truth? Where the Bible.
Yeah.
Oh, how about that? That continues to be our authority. And it's so obvious, isn't it? that the Bible is where that message of grace, where Christ's message becomes alive to us, and where we learn so much about being in community together. And a message, grace, right? That should be so obvious and so clear. But it's very Lutheran to say we're pretty purists about we're saved by grace. That's it. It stops right there, and that means a lot of different things, a lot of different times, right? Anything else jump out for you?
Well, how about the words of John 3:16? God so loved the world, he gave his only Son.
Right.
Whoever believes in him shall live.
That is Jesus, and God's action. So who God is. So there's a message of love for the world. There's a lot that message, right? Didn't Luther call it the mini gospel there? Yeah.
Maybe also an individual relationship with God or a personal relationship with God that's not dependent on the church hierarchy.
Yeah. Yeah, and showed us that with Luther, that became so critical to that whole thing, that it was about this real relationship with a God of love, and that we desire that for ourselves and for each other, right?
Yeah.
Right. Anything else?
Technology is wonderful, but I'm real concerned about the young people. I talk to a lot of them. Any answer they want, they can find. Technology. But faith is abstract, grace is abstract. It's hard for them to grasp that. They want a factual picture of exactly what that is. And they can't cope. They cannot cope with something being abstract.
Did you all hear that?
No.
So she's making the comment for our younger generation, the difficulty of grasping the abstract reality of what faith is. And sometimes that's a developmental issue. That's where my brain went to, that they kind of are hearing facts, or they're going to get on the internet just facts. But so that's a reality of a tool, maybe effective, or it may be also distracting or giving the incorrect messages.
We're drowning in information.
Yeah.
I heard a professor from Luther Seminary say that the average person at the time of Martin Luther would encounter less new information over the course of his entire life than is in one issue of the New York Times. And so we have the entire internet at our fingertips, and so we have a whole different problem than our ancestors did in having to sort through the information, and
there's so many sources of information. So when you think back then, because they didn't have that, they had to rely on some source of who was right, someone that they believed, whether it be the church, the pastor or whatever, but you didn't have, I'm sure, that questioning of.
And so for me, one pathway through that can be, I'm hearing that part of the conversation, that we set aside information to go back to relationship, that we now go back to telling story and giving testimony like Joyce did today. And then suddenly the church, what holds up, the church is community, it's the people in relationship together. And somehow it maybe is less about learning the facts of our faith to actually hearing the stories from one another of how faith, how God becomes real to you, how God speaks to you, how God guides you, and that it becomes from a trusted relationship of a person that you know. Could be.
Yeah, do we find ourselves getting to issues where when we talk Reform, suddenly that becomes liberal, and Orthodox becomes conservative, and then we stop in our tracks and don't think, and the way we maybe should to look at things.
Yeah, and thank you for that, because it isn't liberal or conservative. So liberals would be you throw things out and you move forward fast. Conservative would be you slow it down and you hold on and you that's one version of conservative liberal. But I think reform is more of taking that hard work to going down to the core of it. So let's just use an example. We're going to go to the next slide, Ann, as we talk about, I think these are, I gotta do this, sorry. I'll just give this illustration. Once you understand what it is that you're about, we're about sharing the message of Christ and the word of grace. And how we do it, that can change. So here's the story. Some of you know Kodak. What happened to Kodak? Anybody know their story? Exactly. There was the answer. So Kodak, like a lot of companies, was in the photography business, right? And but they were in the film making business. And film, as you know, was delightful, and then it became a pain because you had to take this roll and get it developed and get your pictures back. In the meantime, we've got the phone company adding a little app called a camera that started making digital pictures. And Kodak lost the shift because they were in the filmmaking business. They weren't in the photography business. And so when photography made the leap, as you were right, from film to digital, they were lost. And so that, to me, is what reform is about. We have to go back and say, what exactly is our mission? And then be clear, that's the method, and are we holding on to methods instead of our mission? Does that help? Is that a little crisper for you? And I think that is our tradition. And so think of what kinds of changes did Martin Luther himself go through personally? Do you remember from confirmation, wherever? What kinds of changes did he embrace as he moved?
Well, you talked about him going to confession and working hard and doing his penance and that. It was when he read the scriptures and realized he is saved by grace. And that just changed him completely.
Right.
He's saved by God's grace.
And isn't that great? And he said, and I learned it through Scripture. And so he came to have a new mission. I think everyone should have access to the Scripture. And you were telling us what happened when he decided, I'm going to translate this Bible into German. Mm-hmm. What came after that?
He translated from the Greek and from the Hebrew, the Bible, into German, and that began a movement of literacy, right? And it also, the words that he chose to use and the style that he wrote in became the standard for the German language because it had never been standardized before. There were all these little areas that had different words and different phrases and different ways of writing, and he kind of came up with, it's called Hochdeutsch, right? High German was his translation of the Bible.
So, but his heart was, I want everyone to hear this message, you're saved by grace. You do that by getting the Scripture into your hands, and now you need to learn to read. And then comes the small catechism. We're not going to teach this in church. We're going to send this to people's homes and invite the parents now to teach faith. Yeah.
Well, we have to remember the invention of the printing press at that same period, which helped enormously. Otherwise, it would have been only a few people that saw Luther's translation.
Exactly. And so we go back now to social media and to live streaming and technology and say, you're right, there's so many frustrating things and things that are just getting in our way. But can we also see that might be a technology that's going to help the church share its message that we are saved by grace? I don't know. As I told you, I'm going to go back to retirement. Just amazing. All right, so let's just wrestle a little bit bit with our own kind of vision. St. Matthew's mission statement. Again, we want to be welcoming, nurturing faith, equipping, and sending to the world. So I hear some of you and others in this congregation spent hours and hours and hours coming up with some new vision statements. I'll tell you what, they're not too earth-shatteringly new. You want to worship, you want to serve your community involvement, you want to somehow connect with the needs in your local community. We're going to use this building and serve our community. We're going to minister to the children and youth. We're going to do that. And we see small groups at the heart of that is build community. That's how I read it. Sorry, that took me like 30 seconds. And y'all worked on that for hours and hours. I'm teasing you. Because behind this become this really, really the hard work of saying, okay, now I know what the mission is, worship, that we continue to have engaging worship. And we experienced it today, if you were at 8:30. But it begins to say, how do we continue to make that? Are we willing to let go of some things or add some things around what worship looks like? So just thank you. Some of you are a little bit older. As you think over the years and decades of worship that you've participated in, what has changed?
Liturgy.
Liturgy. Say more. Just say more about liturgy.
More of the traditional liturgy and confession of sins.
Okay, both the language has changed, the music has changed, maybe even all the elements of the liturgy have changed.
The color of the hymnal.
How many hymnals have we gone through? Four. You've seen four in your lifestyle. You got probably 2 more to go. Yeah. Why is the church just changing hymnals? In the I don't know, and I wish they wouldn't have. If we could just say, in the spirit of reform, what about worship was important to do?
Well, the first one I was exposed to as a little girl was the Augustinian hymnal. You know, that was very Scandinavian, Swedish. And then the SBH came about, Service Book and Hymnal, with the joining in of all of the various ethnic groups. Then the LBW came, I don't know why, the ELW came as a try to bring the LCA, ALC, and the Missouri Synod together. That was the whole basis of that. Now the Missouri Synod pulled out, but and then each hymnal has brought in more and more music, for example, of various ethnicities.
Yeah, it's become more
global
hymnody.
And just a point that Pastor Sheila made recently too, is that the language changed. Why don't I know the Lord's Prayer anymore?
Yeah, that was yours too. Here I raise my Ebenezer. Yeah, you know, I think that was one of yours too, Sheila, of that, how the language it changes, and somehow the church wrestles with that. And that just sounds like a really tough committee to be on, doesn't it? To make the new hymnal. That just looks like a lot of detail and a lot of discussion, but that's what reform is about. It's slow and tedious and confusing and just like swimming through peanut butter is always my image.
I had 2 professors at Luther who were part of it, and they received hate mail.
Oh.
How dare you change my hymnal?
Yeah. Or things, and then the pieces we missed. There might have been something that really was endearing to you.
But that's the method, right?
That's the method.
The mission. Yeah.
The mission.
Because I think there was even now there's controversy about praise bands, right?
Yeah.
Like there's different instrumentation that we never had before, something other than the organ, you know? Right?
I have never been in a church with 3 timpanis.
Timpanis.
Had timpanis,
Oh.
yeah. Yeah, and is the instrument the critical part, you know? It's our, we love it, you know, or we don't love it, but it's not the heart of worship.
I think one thing I've seen over the years is acceptance of other churches. At least our synod is very accepting of, you know, God did not want division. And we've done a great job of dividing. I mean, even Lutherans divided Lutherans, so that's all man-made. But I think there's been more acceptance of, we are all God's children. And that's it. And man-made rules have changed the rest of it.
I know our time is, and just thank you for that. Our time is up, and this is the work. This is the future here that St. Matthew's has been wrestling with to discern. And that conversation will be continuing for a few more years. Yeah, absolutely, and it's good work. But I think if nothing else in this takeaway, and our time is up, is just to say, what does it mean to be a reforming church? That the hard work is to go down to the core, and once we know our mission, then it's easier to kind of evaluate the method, to say keep or try something different. And so we hope that that's a recognizing from the past and what we're in the middle of, where we might be going into the future. One last comment.
I just want to mention the last thing that Martin's life was a movement of his heart, not just his head. And I think that is part of the core of Lutheran also, our hearts.
Great last word. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.